So our next content module for this particular course is the Learning Goals module. So if you would go ahead and access this module, it's a little bit different. This is also quite essential, very similar to differentiation. Every teacher in the classroom is going to need to know how to do this. So we're going to work through it. It's a process. So the more you do it, the better you will get at doing it. You can read the caption there. It's talking about learning goals will help focus student learning. So you really want to be able to specifically take whatever content standards you're using. For us, it's the TEKS, and you want to be able to break down that TEKS into measurable learning components. And so we're going to kind of work with that for the next couple of weeks and get hopefully familiar with the process by which to do that, as well as really a key piece there is not only breaking down the standard, whatever the standard may be, into measurable learning outcomes, but also connecting an assessment with that learning outcome that actually measures what it is that you want students to master. So again, and I think this is one of the more important systems that teachers need to be able to understand. But again, you've got to be able to practice it and get good at it. So that's kind of my goal for us as we move through this particular content module. So let's go ahead and access the content within the module, establishing learning goals and activities. And this will be kind of the specific content that I want you to utilize as you kind of prepare your own chart, which we'll access here in just a few moments as well. So go ahead and review the essential questions, become familiar with those. What are learning goals? How are they important to instruction? How do they guide instruction? As well as the linking of a specifically aligned assessment that truly measures that learning outcome or learning goal. You might hear the term used kind of synonymously: learning objectives, learning outcomes, learning goals. Learning goals are usually pretty broad, and objectives or outcomes are more specifically measured. So I usually try to use the term student learning outcome, or SLO. That's something that you'll hear as well. It's kind of the acronym SLO, which means student learning outcome. But you're taking a specific content TEKS or standard, depending on where you're teaching, and you're breaking that down into measurable components, while you're also considering how to increase student cognition. So there's kind of the process, and it may sound overall complicated, but once you really determine a system by which to unpack the standard, as well as develop the measurable learning outcomes for low-level cognition to higher-level cognition, and then aligning an assessment or a student activity that truly shows or measures student progress at that level, it really is good teaching. And so that's what I want us to practice and become familiar with as we go and interact in this learning module. So there's a series of readings here, as well as a presentation that I developed several years ago, taking the TEKS in particular. They're not elementary TEKS, they're, I think, high school TEKS, and kind of breaking those down into measurable learning outcomes. But first, before you get into the presentation, this particular presentation, I would encourage you to go ahead and read like these different shorter articles about how to do this, how to align learning goals with assessments, and why they're important, how they help focus and centralize student learning. Then here in this last link, Lead Forward resources, that's something that we utilize in Texas that really helps teachers take a specific content TEKS and see how that TEKS is broken down into more measurable components. I will say, and this is just a caveat for this particular link and resource, it has a lot of really good information in it. However, it also can have so much information in it that it may become confusing or become overwhelming. So I would encourage you to use this, but I wouldn't necessarily spend so much time in the Lead Forward resources particularly if it's becoming overwhelming. Frankly, I've used it here and there, and I'm not an expert at using that resource either. It certainly came available after I'd already left the public classroom in the state of Texas. So as a teacher in the classroom in Texas, I never had this resource. So I'm encouraging you to use it. It does have a tremendous amount of detail and specificity that you can utilize across the content, not just social studies. But with that said, I'm not a person that could probably train you more efficiently in using that resource. So let's look at this and get real familiar with these specificities in the content. And then I want to go back and show you the two activities that are associated with this information. First, because this journal entry is going to be based on what you're creating in this assignment module, which is learning goals and learning activities. And you will see that there is an instructional alignment chart. This is what you're going to be completing. And it is all of Bloom's different levels of cognition. I noticed that I did not have a chart with Bloom's taxonomy included in this assignment module. So I'll probably go back and add one. Typically, if it's a face-to-face class, I encourage students to find a Bloom's taxonomy chart that they feel is most comfortable for them to use. What I'll do is find one, and then you can reference that, or you can find your own. You can certainly Google Bloom's taxonomy chart, and there will be so many of them pop up, and they're all pretty similar. What I will encourage you to do is we're looking at low-level Bloom's taxonomy or low-level cognition, and we start with knowledge, right? The basic knowledge of something. So every standard that you will access, every TEKS that you will access has a basic starting point, which would be the knowledge level. You can't really move forward with comprehension or application or some of the other higher level cognition until students have a basic understanding of whatever it is, the content that you're trying to teach or the concept that you're trying to teach. And again, this isn't just exclusive to social studies. This is fundamental for all content areas. Sometimes, however, particularly at the elementary level, we like to stay at this level. We think students won't be able to progress to some of the higher level cognitive abilities, so we stay at the knowledge level. And I want you to think, once you've chosen your social studies TEKS, and again, this can be first grade, second grade, third grade, maybe a little bit easier because I think the example's actually fifth grade, but it may be a little bit easier to develop this chart considering some TEKS that have more specific content, which at that point you're looking at fourth grade, fifth grade. So figure out what TEKS it is that you want to unpack and develop student learning outcomes. And then really this chart is about what activity would the teacher use in order to teach to that level of cognition. In other words, what would you do as the teacher in order to teach the basic knowledge of that standard? And then what would you use to measure? In other words, what activity or assessment? I think we can, I teach the instructional assessment course, and we talk about learning activities really are formative assessments to where students are developed, and it could be something that they do in class. It doesn't have to be something that's scored or graded. It could be something that they do on the smart board. It could be something they do on the computer. But what is it that you have in place that measures student productivity and mastery at this particular level? And then I want you to jump up into the next level, which is comprehension. Like for instance, here you need to think of what verb could you develop. So the verb here within Bloom's taxonomy is knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, evaluate, and really I reference in class, create or synthesis. Those are synonymous. But as you're developing your learning outcome, what descriptive verb really is at that level? So for instance, knowledge, if I said I want my students to be able to list the different things that are important to being a good citizen. Well, if a student lists something, that's usually pretty low level. That's not something, they're not comparing, contrasting, they're not evaluating, they're just making a list about things that, well, that would be a knowledge learning outcome, a knowledge level learning outcome. Students will be able to list 3 different important elements of being a good citizen. And that would be obviously something that you teach them. And then what would you do to measure that? How would they list that? Would they list it on a piece of paper? Would they list that on the smart board? Would they make a list and then draw a picture? Which that would raise the level of cognition, but there's still that list on it. So listing would be a knowledge level outcome. Comprehension, a lot of times the verb that we utilize to measure comprehension is the student will be able to explain whatever, explain why voting is an important element of being a good citizen. So you see, I'm using this theme of being a good citizen as kind of my TEKS, because there are several TEKS within elementary social studies that talks about citizenship. But here they'll be able to explain why voting in particular is an element of being a good citizen, and how will you measure their explanation? Will they put it on a note card? Will they type it in a blog? Like, for instance, I have you explaining how you will use this chart by entering a journal entry. Okay, well, my prompt in the journal entry increases it beyond just comprehension. So you'll explain how you apply it, and you'll probably even use analysis within your journal entry for me. Now, at a 4th grade level, you're probably going to keep it at just explanation. So again, those are the things that you kind of work through as you develop this chart. Application, so now they're going to practice with it, or they're going to develop something with it. Students will be able to apply or develop a chart that explains how voting is important. The chart also explains why why obeying the laws are important. So in other words, now they're taking all the information that they used and learned here and that they can explain here, and they're putting it into a system that better elaborates it. So you can see where it's just a progression of getting a little bit more difficult. So the analysis, a good verb there would be compare and contrast, evaluate, to differentiate between 2 things and which one's more important. That would, and sometimes the evaluate doesn't have a correct answer. Like if you take the chart that let's say they developed at the application level, where they have 4 things a good citizen's supposed to do, and then here you're saying, okay, from that chart, I want you to evaluate which one's the most important. Well, there may not be one that is more important than the other, but you're not asking them to definitively say that it's more important. You're asking them to pick one, and then they prove it based on their research or based on the things that they can find that would support their opinion. Because if I say, well, voting is more important than obeying the laws, well, that's not necessarily true. But if I say obeying the laws is more important than voting, that may not be necessarily true. So it's really about finding the evidence that would support your claim, particularly at this level. And then synthesis, again, is synonymous with create. So now that students have learned all this, what are they going to create from it? This is the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. And oftentimes as teachers, we really don't get to this point. Or we say, well, that's going to take too much instructional time, so I'm going to have, and this is where students can really thrive. Their level of creativity, it doesn't make any difference if they're 1st grade or 5th grade. Their level of creativity is just phenomenal now with technology. But again, it doesn't have to be something they create using technology, but it could be something that they create using technology. So think in terms of this chart being what the teacher does in this particular column, and then what the student will do to show that they are mastering the learning outcome in this particular column. So it really is teacher does, student does. And then again, it is a work in progress. You're not going to be exceptional at this right off. It's something that takes a lot of time. and really it takes some time in the classroom to teach it and to experiment with it, always constantly pushing students to a higher level of thinking. I've got sometimes my colleagues and I disagree about what a student can do. And of course, my experience in the classroom has always been with high school. So maybe I'm a bit naive when it comes to what a first grader can do or a second grader can do, but I have a son who is now a junior in college. So as a parent, I really pushed what he could do and how and the things that he encountered, whether it be his thought process or whether it be kinesthetic engagement, whatever. It was always, okay, you can do that. Now let's make it a little bit more difficult and challenge you to see if you can move up. And that's essentially what this chart is doing, is that, okay, you know it and you can explain it, but can you put it in a system and can you compare it with other systems to see how it functions with other systems? And then can you evaluate within the system which one or which component is more important? And now can you develop something or create something from what you now have learned as you move and progress forward? So that's really the chart. Here's an example of one. Again, I think this is based on 5th grade TEKS. So, use this as kind of an exemplar and a little bit of a sample. You'll see down here also the TEKS are listed and then the Lead Forward resource as well. As I mentioned, I will add a Bloom's taxonomy feature in this module. So experiment with this and this will be kind of the next couple of weeks. You'll notice here there is a journal entry, again, based on your alignment chart, but also looking at some of the information from Chapter 8 that will help you with this as well. If you don't have the text, you can certainly utilize the articles within the content module that I showed you earlier that are in there associated with the essential questions. So the idea here is just to continue to work and develop and practice this skill, very similar to differentiation. If you're not organizing differentiation and thinking about how you want to differentiate, you're probably not going to do it. If you're not thinking about how you want to unpack the standard and develop learning outcomes and then attach an aligned assessment to that learning outcome to make sure students are actually learning, you're probably not going to do that very well either. So it just takes practice and it takes, you'll make your mistakes, but the idea is to think about what went wrong and then fix that. And as I mentioned with differentiation, so I'll go back and kind of look at the overall, our overall Blackboard course. And you should be kind of concluding at least with the format wheel and understanding differentiation and ready to move into developing your learning goals and your learning chart, your learning goals and learning activities chart. Those are the wheel and the chart are my method of helping you as a tool to organize these processes. As you move into your own classroom, you may develop your own techniques and tools. However, I will say, and I say this to the students that I see face-to-face, I probably said it on an instructional video similar to this. If you can do those two things, if you can organize differentiation by some formula, whether it be the format wheel or some other technique that you've come across and researched, and if you can develop a learning activities and learning outcomes and learning activities chart that moves students from knowledge all the way up to create, and your activities are specifically aligned with your outcomes, then you're going to be a really good teacher if you can do those two things. The lesson planning and some of the other nuts and bolts that we talk about as teachers, those are important as well. But if you can do these two things, plan for differentiation, and then organize your instruction so that you're moving students from low-level thinking to higher-level thinking while assessing them with aligned assessments, yeah, those are fundamental pieces for good teaching. You've got to be able to do those, or number one, you're probably not differentiating for all the different students in your classroom. And number two, you're probably not measuring whether or not they truly understand or know what it is that you want them to know. Or you're keeping them at a lower level cognition and you're not moving them up to a higher level cognition. And so I will say video games do a really good job of moving student thinking to a higher level much better sometimes than teachers do in their own classroom. So we've got to get better at this. And again, this chart that you're going to be working with for the next couple of weeks is nothing more than a tool by which to do that. So go ahead and experiment with this. Do the best you can. Look at the resources. Look at the example. Send me any questions you may have because I want you to get good at this. But, choose your TEKS. Again, I would think 4th or 5th grade probably best for this activity, but you don't have to go there. You can go to 2nd, 3rd grade TEKS, 1st grade TEKS. And then, again, just use your resources and organize what you can. Let me know if you have any questions.